few days ago, my friend Ryan HeavyHead made a video called Beware the Rectangles, in which he talked about a kind of hypnotic awareness problem that we have in relation to nature, in that we are often found in nature but not really aware of nature. And there were a couple of other important aspects to his gentle rant, as he called it, including the idea that there isn't really an us and them, that this is sort of a construct, and also that the rectangle is a hypnotic induction device which is being used very ubiquitously in our culture without our common awareness. I wanted to take some time and respond to some of these ideas with my own video, which I'm calling Scare the Rectangles, because I think that armed with the proper awareness and understanding, we can transform our relationship with some of these elements of our human experience and culture. Possibly we can produce something like an untrance, kind of way of continuous awakening, and that we can explore ways to radically alter our relationships with our culture and its transports. Before I go much further, I'd like to take a moment and issue this gentle warning, which is that we are going to use recursion in the sense that we're going to bend the power of the rectangle, in which you're probably watching this video, back upon itself and use it against the power of rectangles. This is a strategy familiar to many people in martial arts, where we are often trained to redirect the momentum of an opponent rather than produce our own and meet the opponent with that. There is a possibility of using recursion in a very subversive and kind of radical way, particularly when we're dealing with paradox. And I think as we move forward in my discussion, we will see that many of the features of the problems that we face in our cultures, in our thought and in our awareness, have to do both with paradox and perhaps to some degree with recursion. And there's a peculiar form of recursion known as feedback, which most musicians are familiar with, and a lot of videographers are familiar with this as well, because when we direct an input source to receive input from its own output, we get this effect. And well, for guitar players, this produces a sort of screaming wail from an amplifier, and for a videographer, it produces a kind of hall of mirrors effect. Now, it's my experience that consciousness itself has something to do with recursion or self-reference or reflexivity. And since we're going to be looking at some of the features of consciousness, including hypnosis, meditation, and a kind of unconscious trance-like behavior, I think it's important to introduce this concept at the beginning. Fundamentally, I'm hoping that you will have an experience of invitation here, an invitation to explore many of these avenues of our cognitive and relational selves. So, enough about the warning. In terms of the idea that there is no us and them, I think it's important to recognize that there are some very peculiar features of our evolutionary and biological heritage that we should pay close attention to in the beginning. We belong to a phylum known as Bilateria. This means bilateral, essentially, or bilaterally, and involves a bilateral symmetricity. We are bilaterally symmetrical. What most of us are not clearly aware of is that the two sides of our body are actually very different, even though they look like reflections of one another. The right ear hears differently than the left ear. The right eye sees a bit differently than the left eye. The right side of our body, including our hand and our foot, functions relatively differently from the left side, whether we are right or left-handed. And this is in part due to the peculiar structure of our brains. We are a dual hemisphere creature, and these hemispheres have some astonishing properties that many of us are not aware of. The left hemisphere, which contains the languaging, many of the languaging elements, even though these are also influenced by the right hemisphere, is pretty much the one who talks, the one talking to you right now. And this hemisphere is only aware, the left hemisphere that is, of the right half of the body. It doesn't see the left half as part of itself. Given the proper stimulus, it might even attack the other side of the body as an invader. It is prone to building narratives and stories and models of things, which are often very reductive, catastrophically inaccurate, can be almost completely invented, and yet it will happily champion these models against any and all comers. It's very interested in acclaim and getting noticed, and it doesn't have really any awareness or esteem for its other half. In fact, the left hemisphere has a set of fibers that connect it to the right, which actually actively inhibit the right hemisphere, particularly while we are talking and while we are awake. And of course, these two hemispheres compete for fuel, which in this sense we could clumsily call sugar. And when the left hemisphere is active, like mine is right now, the right hemisphere is pretty much thoroughly inhibited. So the left hemisphere seems to me a bit like a prosthesis with which the right hemisphere, that has some very different capacities and functions, comes to know the world. The right hemisphere is aware of both halves of the body. It's aware of its sinister companion. And it is not very talkative. It doesn't have a concrete idea of self. It has a relatively liquid idea of self, which is familiar to us more from dreaming than from our waking experience. And the right hemisphere is involved in things like spatio-temporal evaluation, making sure we don't bump into things that preserve our survival. If the right hemisphere were to become like the left and become interested in being noticed and complimented and such, we probably wouldn't live very long, or we would live in a very injured state, because the right hemisphere is often too busy kind of keeping us alive to take the stage and be applauded. So you can see that we are, in this sense, somewhat internally conflicted, and I think most of our lives we live in a linguistic, trance-like state, where we tell ourselves stories, and the more we tell them, the more we believe them, and these stories seem to be good models of ourselves and the world, our history, what things mean, how we, what value they have, what their functions are, things like this. These are all pretty much linguistic models that we follow in our waking lives. So it seems to me that we awaken from sleep into a set of trance-like behaviors where we become unconscious of ourselves, of the world around us, of our potentials, for the sake of more deeply following linguistics, language, stories, narratives. So I think one of the things that's interesting is that we have a kind of an us and them built into us. The right hemisphere understands the whole game as us. The left hemisphere basically sees them. And these two, although they function together in healthy bodies and minds as a unity, much like our body tends to do, we are deeply conflicted. And when we say we're talking about, for example, the self, well, we're really only talking about the part of the self that talks. In other words, the part of the self that recognizes itself as the self is less than half of the self, and it's really difficult to get that other part involved in the dialogue or expressing itself clearly. It's not impossible. Neuroscientists have discovered ways to kind of peek at the consciousness of the right hemisphere under peculiar conditions. and often it is found in the boldest kind of contradiction to whatever the left is saying. There are some other ways that this us and them story pervades both our history and culture, and in fact, it seems pretty clear to me that the left hemisphere, which is dominant in our common experience, is also dominant in our cultures, and that our cultures are being led around into catastrophic misbehavior, misrelation, confusion, rapacious misunderstanding of our relationship with nature and each other, and every kind of trouble by stories, books, laws, rules, concrete linguistic constructs that we follow as though they are reality, when in fact most of reality is missing from them. They are gross reductions of reality. But this has been going on a long time. In the Bible, in the early part of the Bible, after the big trouble at the tree, we come across Cain and Abel. Cain is essentially a farmer, a tiller of earth, a divider of matters, much like the left hemisphere is. Abel is born second, kind of a shepherd, brings things together and watches their shapes as they flow over the land, not really imposing his will on anything, much like the right hemisphere. Cain becomes concerned that perhaps God likes Abel better and gets them to engage in a contest where they both make an offering to God. God prefers Abel's offering. Cain decides to kill Abel, thus banishing him to the underworld, possibly the land of dreaming, where in fact our right hemisphere seems to come into a dominant relationship with the left, and then goes on to lie to God about it. This is really interesting because, of course, the left hemisphere has been basically proven to sit around lying a lot in certain neuropsychological experiments done by people like V.S. Ramachandran, and in many experiments throughout the history of psychology and neuroscience. So we can see that this paradigm of us and them kind of goes way, way back into our history, and in fact, it seems to me that the story of Cain and Abel is a bit of a parable about our cognitive nature, and also about which half won the initial conflict. It seems pretty clear that the left hemisphere owns our modern cultures and our civilization, and is driving them toward extremely self-destructive and very deceptive forms of behavior, which it continues to aggrandize and demand as the only reasonable or possible way forward, which of course is silly. Now, this conflict goes back to nomads and farmers, people who wander around on the land following the seasons and food sources and animals, versus people who settle on the land and own it and want to defend it and plant crops in specific places and cycles. There's an interesting parallel here between a Navajo creation story and the Cain and Abel story. In the Navajo creation story, the firstborn, or the Cain-like brother, is called something like Slayer of Alien Gods, or just Warrior. And the second born child, who is his companion, is called something like Little Water of the Moon, or just Shaman. And in the Navajo creation stories, these two brothers don't kill each other. They don't enter combat against each other. They work as a unified pair, which is interesting. That the Judeo-Christian model shows these two brothers in conflict and one killing the other, and that the Navajo model shows them as dancing together with and for each other for mutual progress and uplift. Now, one of the reasons I compare these two stories is that actually the word Abel comes from a more accurate pronunciation, which would be hevel. And this means something like puff of vapor, like the puff of vapor that comes when you go, onto a mirror. And of course, the two brothers in the Navajo stories are very similar. One of them is a divider of things, right? Divides them from life, the warrior, and the other is called Little Water of the Moon, and vapor is implied here. In the Navajo story, the implication is that the warrior is born of the sun and the shaman is born of the moon. And this implication did not survive if it was ever part of the biblical story. I think we have a perhaps more significant place we can examine this conflict, which is in simply nature itself versus human culture. In this case, we see human culture trying to dominate, reduce to resources, right? We reduce nature to resources, which we then sell or trade, destroy, and pretty much not pay any attention to nature. We're terrified of it. It seems like perhaps God likes nature best, so we should kill it. Or in our human insecurity, we feel threatened by the incredible fertility, dynamism, and abundance of nature, and so we want to have a representational relationship with it, a sort of pornographization of nature, where we're only really interacting with the parts that we can dominate and manipulate. And then, of course, our technology becomes the prosthesis of this, in that we can see we represent functions of nature in technology which we then own and dominate, thus extracting nature's magic into something we can concretely and completely own, understand, deploy. In every case, this reduction is sort of tragic in the same way that pornography is a tragic reduction of human intimacy. Now, that's not to say that all aspects of technology are only thus. These matters are intrinsically paradoxical. We use our linguistic consciousness to lead and also to recognize the world around us. In many cases, when we don't have a name for something, we really are not aware of it. And so it seems that language, in a sense, is a technology of putting handles on experiences so that we can manipulate and recognize them more readily. This isn't in itself bad. What's difficult is when we are not aware of the conflicts involved, of the dangers involved in reduction and the use of language and technologies, nor really are we aware of the profound opportunities that are hidden by these dangers. And this is part of what I want to talk about as we continue forward today. Now, with our complex bicameral minds, we are prone to various kinds of trance-like states. Some of these states can involve increased awareness of our surroundings and relationships, and others will tend to anesthetize us to some degree and to make what could be conscious to kind of keep it hidden in our unconscious. And in order to explore these, I'd like to talk about two specific forms of human activity that are familiar, at least by name, to most of us: hypnosis and meditation. To begin with, I'd like to talk about hypnosis. And what you see here is a advertisement for a visual focus, which is often used to induce hypnosis. In this case, it's a spinning spiral. And if you look carefully at the spiral, you will notice that it appears to, in fact, if you focus on it a little bit, you'll see that it produces these strange kind of moving artifacts, which are common. We would call them an optical illusion. But actually, this is an effect that is not entirely unlike feedback. And it strikes me that hypnosis is, in a sense, a way of bending consciousness back upon itself, so that the trance-inducing momentum of consciousness becomes itself the focus and leads us deeper and deeper into a hypnotic state. Now, actual hypnotism is fairly rigorously defined, and it often, when we are hypnotized, we will usually display fairly obvious symptoms of this, such as catalepsy, the tendency to close the eyes, often with a fluttering motion, deep relaxation, increased suggestibility, heightened imagination, and focused attention. And we can also experience actual anesthesia, meaning not being aware of pain. Hypnosis is a very complex phenomenon that is still to this day not rigorously understood. Some of the more dominant theories presently imply that hypnosis primarily affects the left hemisphere and is very involved with languaging. However, there are some conflicting ideas about this, and animals, as we know from experiment, can often be hypnotized, and they don't seem to have any rigorous representational function like our language is. And there are some theories that suppose that it's a left hemisphere door to right hemisphere activation. All of this is fairly confusing at the moment. We don't have a clear consensus from research on the hemispheric lateralization features of hypnosis. But it normally begins with repetitive optical focus, to focus very carefully on a single object, or it can also begin with an audio induction, the sound of the human voice. And the rhythm and tone and nature of this voice is somewhat important in producing and sustaining the hypnotic trance. Now, Ryan is suggesting that many of the features in our modern culture induce hypnosis, and I think this is a provocative idea that's useful to explore, but I'd like to differentiate between actual hypnosis and what I'm going to call a trance-like state. Actual hypnosis, as I said earlier, is fairly rigorously defined, but I think we're engaged in trance-like states of pseudo-unconsciousness pretty much consistently. When we awaken from dreaming, we immediately begin sort of restarting our paradigmatic understandings of identity, history, our own and the world's, meaning, value, culture, what we're supposed to be doing, what is correct, what isn't, etc. So I think that we are used to entering this trance-like state, and I also think that when we were little, prior to acquiring language, this wasn't precisely the same. The function and character of the trance-like states that we experienced as children is radically different from those that we tend to experience as adults after we have undergone sufficient languaging and enculturalization. This isn't going to become an important factor as we proceed. Now, one of the things that Ryan was suggesting was that some people who are out in nature, kind of maybe sitting there doing some kind of meditation, are actually in a sort of trance where they're not really aware of where they are or what's going on around them. And I agree, this is certainly a possibility. But before we get too far into that idea, let's move from the spiral, which is a trance induction trigger, to the enso, which is a symbol often associated with meditation. Notice that the inside of the spiral is busy and full and seems to be moving with images of itself. The inside of the enso is empty, and rather than being a closed circle, the enso is open to the world, to nature. It's not filled with constructs, it's filled with openness, like an empty cup. The shape is very organic, and we can see the implication of a being looking back upon its beginnings. We can see the beginning of the enso, and the end of the enso is almost like a face or the head of a worm or a snake consuming its own tail or examining its own tail. And so we can see from the evolved aspect, the end state of the stroke, is actually facing the beginning state of the stroke. This is a very peculiar property. Now, this symbol is often associated with Zen meditation. Meditation in general, we can differentiate from hypnosis in a variety of ways. Often, now of course there are many branches and styles of meditation, each with their own goals and idiosyncrasies, but they tend to share a few features in common. One of them is a profound intimacy with breathing. Another is to stop following thoughts. Another is to allow the mind to settle into its sort of most open relational state, which is a liquid state. It is not a concrete state. It's a flowing kind of state, a changing, freely changing state. And also, most forms of meditation, including Zen, admonish their practitioners to avoid falling into a trance. In other words, to avoid becoming hypnotized. Now, hypnosis is often used to solve problems, to reduce pain, to help us form new models to help us with our self-esteem or psychological issues. Meditation is a little different. Its goal is usually the acquisition of clarity, deepening awareness, insight, clear attention, things like this. So I would contrast these two things, and I would also say that it's easy for some forms of meditation to be hypnotic and to result in trance-like states, as Ryan, I think, pointed out in his video, which I think was his concern, that people doing meditation out in nature were actually not really in nature. They're just in themselves as they were before they got there. That's certainly possible, and probably happens. But not all meditation is thus, and some forms of meditation could, I think, bring us into deep intimacy with nature under the right conditions and in the right kinds of contexts. And now that we've looked at the spiral, which tends to generate a kind of feedback, and the enso, which I think is a symbol of a kind of fluid stillness, let's take a look at the induction trigger that Ryan is most concerned about, and which I think is really worth looking at. It's this, the rectangle. Now right now as I'm talking to you, I am sitting at my desk, which is a rectangle, with my computer, which is a rectangle. And before me on the screen of my computer is a rectangle with a rectangle with a rectangle in it. Off to my left is the rectangle of my television. My bookshelves, which are rectangles, are filled with rectangular books. My DVDs are rectangles, my bed is a rectangle, the table is a rectangle, my bathtub is a rectangle. Just about everywhere I go, there are rectangles all around me. When I go to the store, everything's packaged in rectangles. We take those up to another rectangle where we pay for them with little green rectangles or checks in the shape of rectangles. They put these in rectangular bags, and we walk out of the store with a rectangle filled with rectangles that we got at the rectangle. To call the shape ubiquitous would be the wildest kind of understatement. And Ryan would like us to recognize that this shape is profoundly ubiquitous in our culture and is the transport of cultural content, and in fact a kind of induction trigger for a trance-like state. I think this is a provocative and powerful argument. The rectangle authorizes and legitimizes whatever kind of content appears within it, whether that is a book or a film or even an advertisement. And all of these things take advantage of our implicit capacity to enter trance-like states, which I think is an anciently evolved evolutionary capacity. They take advantage of this to manipulate us, essentially, and to keep us enmeshed in the culture and divided from what the rectangle and its content that it transports is a substitute for. And I think it's really important to recognize that this shape and the content that it carries are substitutes for something else. Now, it's an incredibly powerful thing to put a frame on something. It immediately changes how we see that thing and how we understand it, how we authorize it, or are skeptical of it. And I'd just like us to take a moment to notice that we're constantly bombarded with this. All of the art is in rectangular frames. Everything around us is like this. Now, one of the things that is important to realize about hypnosis is that we have to kind of ignore that we're being hypnotized in order to proceed with the induction. And so when we recognize the power of this shape in our culture and in our experience, we have a chance to escape the induction. We have a chance to observe what the content is, where it comes from, what it means, what it is suggesting or aggrandizing. We have a shot at not going with the flow. And I think this is really important because the forms of intelligence that are producing the lion's share of what is presented in the rectangles are not our allies. These are, in fact, the most disembodied forms of left hemisphere-like propagandism whose agendas are terrifying, misinformed, delusional, catastrophic, paranoid, extremely aggressive. They want to own more and more terrain. They want us to become transports of their message. They want to recruit us, to induct others into the paradigms that we learn to identify with through the content delivered via the rectangles. There's lots of incredibly crucial reasons for us to both resist, question, and transform the message and what the nature of the content being carried across and through the rectangles is. Within our culture, we often have difficulty getting just the basic distance required from the constant immersion in representation to sense what is being lost, what is being replaced. An excellent example of this is just the television. When we moved from nature, where all around us things were moving all the time, the sky, the sun, animals, plants, trees, always moving, and moving in patterns that our biology evolved in synchrony with for millions and millions of human lifetimes, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So when we're taken from that context and put in a box, which is essentially the context that most of us inhabit these days, it's not too hard to understand why everyone would gather around the television. The rectangle or square in the main gathering room where things are moving. That's the place where things are moving on it. And so this is one example of the kind of substitution that we experience without really being aware of it. We are used to being in the dynamic, colorful, rhythmic embrace of natural beings and their movements, and spaces and their movements. And when we're taken out of that and just put in a box, we're hungry for it. And so when the television comes on, everybody gathers around it and essentially undergoes induction and ends up in a kind of pseudo-hypnotic trance. The computer is kind of the next generation of that. Things don't always move as dynamically on the computer. In fact, there's much more still representation of still image and text. But this seems to be the next step, right? Less movement, more concrete representation. And again, we're neglecting what is being substituted because we're probably just not aware of it. Now, when I was a young man, when I was 14, I left human culture entirely. And this is the place I left from. This was my launch pad. I actually went to this place to leave from it, so this isn't exactly the place I was running away from. As you can see here, we've got some interesting features. There's a little bit of sky, a lot of trees, a big hotel, the Highlandale Hotel actually in Monterey, and the Russian River a body of flowing water. Now, what happened when I left my urban culture and came here was that I became so intimate with the flowing water, which I think is a profound metaphor for the nature of consciousness and also dreaming. And I think that hypnosis is a way of changing the flow, and meditation is a way of changing the flow, and intimacy is a way of changing the flow of this water of consciousness that I'm talking about. But to get back to my point, my encounter with this flowing water so influenced me that I was unwilling to return to a place where there was no water, or there was still water. And one of the things that gets replaced in our culture is the places of gathering. And these places were generally things like a cave, a tree, or a body of water. Also food sources, places where there were good food sources we gathered. But these fundamental places, watersheds, forest, and places where food is abundant, formed crucial gathering places for us that got substituted inside the boxes we went to inhabit. And when we are separated from these influences, we lose senses of ourselves and senses of the world and senses of what we can become. In effect, we undergo a kind of a relational amputation process that proceeds and whose goal is really to amputate just everything that can possibly be amputated and turn it into some kind of a representation of something that can be dominated, manipulated, or controlled. Including, of course, we do this even with water. We dam rivers, and we make a big problem for the natural world with how we treat particularly flowing water like this river here, which is constantly being polluted. And we don't give much thought to the other beings who are our relational intimates for all of evolutionary history, the animals and plants who depend on this water for their livelihood directly. And when I came here and I became intimate with this water, I was unwilling to go back to the place of rectangles, so I simply ran away. I left culture altogether. And when I did that, I began to rediscover what had been being amputated from me and why I was so frustrated and felt so compelled to rebel and act out in my urban culture. Now, of course, there were other substitutions going on, which I'll get to in a moment. Substitutions for developmental phases that I think are crucial they're crucial to all of our life phases, these developmental aspects of ourselves. But during the teenage years, we are, I think, expecting somehow biologically or instinctively to be recruited into a new way of living, a way that allows us to experience something incredibly profound, which is a state of polyphony-like relation with nature, meaning, and identity. Now, what we get instead with language is a monophonic prosthesis, which we are kind of trained to, how shall I put it, to reshape ourselves into the likeness of. In other words, we become what we interact with. When we interact with language, which delivers meaning in a monotonal, linear fashion, we lose something that we had as children, which was the inherent experience of polyphonic meaning and identity. You can see this in all children, in the playful way that their intelligence and curiosity works, and they learn much more quickly than adults, much more fluidly, and part of it is because they have this very open relationship with identity and meaning that language tends to shut down as we become more and more enlanguaged. Now, what I'm trying to get at is, I think when we reach our teenage years, we're expecting to be, initiated by some group of adults into the sort of mysteries of the next order or the next level of our learning prowess. This doesn't happen. There are no such mentors in our culture. What happens instead is we begin to be prepared for being workers, slaves, for being effectively manipulable elements of the culture at hand. And so we rebel, and we try to find other sorts of behaviors that will lead into this kind of liquid sentience, this deep, intimate learning flow that is our human nature to have. And so we look towards things like psychedelic drugs, which can emulate this deep learning flow, sexual adventurism, behavioral adventurism, extreme ideological concretization, things like this. And it's not to say that none of these have a place in our lives. They do. But when their place is as a substitute for some of the most critical and profoundly vital and dynamic aspects of our minds, our emotional selves, and our relational selves, that is a catastrophe. And that's part of what led me to run away. And when I ran away, I realized just how significant the effects of the culture were, just how profound these amputations really were, what they meant, what I was losing, and what I could reacquire by living on the land itself, with weather, with trees, with the sun, with the moon, with the water. Now that brings me to the next part of my discussion, which is, what is the rectangle a substitute for? What is the spiral a substitute for? What is the enso a substitute for? What are these objects, these representations, substitutes for? What are they getting in the way of? What do we see when all of the substitutes disappear? Well, not too surprisingly, one of the first things we would discover is the sun. All day long, when you're outdoors, away from culture, if you're living on the land, even when camping, this specific entity becomes the most obvious and profound sort of relational companion. One is constantly aware of it. It affects our moods. We rise with the sun. We sleep when it goes down. We become really, synchronized with the solar day. And of course, in our technological cultures, where we spend a lot of time indoors or looking at mechanical objects such as cell phones or computers, this relationship is often broken, or at the least neglected. Really, we can't say enough about the sun. To understand ourselves, we need to continually deepen our understanding of the sun, because we are effectively, as all life on Earth is, an expression of solar phenomenon. It's not hard to understand the Earth itself and all living things as an actual extension of the sun. Without the sun, there would be no language, no religion, no hypnosis, no meditation, no consciousness, no mathematics, no science, nothing. We would have none of the human ideas or structures that we use to evaluate and understand identity and meaning. So in a very real sense, we are a living extension of this star. And the stories that science tells us are cruelly incomplete and incredibly monophonic in terms of identity and meaning. The sun is a big explosion in space that gives birth to all life. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's actually not much like that. The sun is more than a being. Recognize we're looking at something here that is the source, in a very real sense, of all beings. So a thing that is an object, that is merely an object, does not give birth to beings, right? There's no object that you can discover anywhere in human manufacture or on Earth that gives birth to beings. This object, in coupling with the Earth, gives birth to beings. That is not a thing. That is something more than a being. I'm not claiming that it's a god or a spirit or anything like that. I'm saying that it's something that we should look very carefully and enthusiastically more and more deeply into the nature of, because it is nothing like our models, and in fact, we don't even have a word in our language to properly express the identity character of this entity. And it's similar with the Earth. We think of it as a rock in space. It's nothing like that. So again, we can see that we've been crippled by the monophonic rendition of identity and meaning in a world whose very nature is polyphonous. identity and meaning is fundamentally polyphonic. Language trains us to this monophonic sense of meaning because it can only carry monophonic meaning in its ordinary functions. Now, of course, we have things like poetry and song, which introduce forms of polyphony into language, but we don't give them much authority in terms of understanding the whatness or the quiddity of things and beings and relationships. When we are in deep relation with the sun, we are retrieving some of our relational fluidity and some of our natural, implicit intimacy with the world, with ourselves, with nature, with everything that's going on around us. Now, of course, another thing that the rectangle is replacing is this, the sky. In each day we get a new sky with a new character, a seasonal character. We see amazing cloud formations that move and induce in us a kind of a trance-like state, which is a state of enhanced consciousness, even though it may be somewhat dreamlike, rather than a state of inhibited consciousness. And this is the natural result of our immersion in nature. Another thing that we lose when we're placed in boxes, whether those are our cars or our offices or our homes or what have you. One really can't say enough about the sky. I mean, it's the ultimate context and is metaphorically associated really with dreaming, with higher intelligence. We think of the stars as a place where we might find other intelligences more profound than ours. But the constant movement and character of the sky is a non-verbal, linear dreamscape that is, again, crucial for us to have constant direct contact with. Now, by day, the sun is something of an arbiter of identity. The way that it lights and colors everything around us seems to inform a sense that we are singular in a world of multiplicity. So I am the me, like the single light by which I see in the day, and all of the other things are extrinsic to me. I can interact with them or examine or manipulate them. And this is kind of the paradigm of the daytime, but at night things change. Color becomes shadow, and the single light by which all people see becomes many lights, the stars, and then the peculiar timekeeping light of the moon, by which we could easily understand the passage of time through following the phases. If we were to try to understand it with the sun, we would need to have the idea of a calendar, but the moon is effectively a calendar of its own. And anyone familiar or intimate with it would understand that the passage of the phases comprises a form of calendar that everything in nature is paying some attention to. Another fascinating and I think that's the right word here, fascinating feature of the moon is that it unifies the eyes of all beings on the night side of the planet. Every being looks toward the moon and sees it. We don't usually do this with the sun because it's so extremely bright. But the moon ends up being a kind of summation lens for people and other beings on the night side of the planet. They all look to it and see it and notice it together. It's an astonishing unification link or bridge. And of course it also affects our physiology fairly directly. Another thing that most of us become unaware of when we have substitutes, like the television, the computer, and our lights. So the moon is another thing we lose intimacy with, another thing that's being substituted for by the culture. Another induction trigger for what I'm calling this kind of liquid sentience, which is, when you see animals accomplishing extraordinary feats of acrobatics or relation, this is because they're in a state of kind of hyper-awareness, sort of the opposite of a trance, really. And this state, I'm calling it liquid sentience, but what I want you to understand is that this is our natural state. Were we to be removed from our cultures for a significant enough period of time, we would sort of naturally begin to return to this fluid, profoundly aware, liquidly intimate learning explosion. I mean, it's a state of constant immersion in relation and learning. And this is the state that psychedelic drugs emulate, but don't really deliver. We can tell they don't deliver it because it's very difficult to bring things that we think we have learned in these psychedelic states, back into our waking consciousness in a way where they can be meaningfully communicated to other humans. But the state that I'm calling liquid sentience, this fluid intimacy of learning process or momentum, is not like that. It has some of the features of the psychedelic experience, but instead of just having a sort of a relational sensuality, what we have is a relational and intellectual analog of sensuality, which is actually learning rather than merely sensing. And so we're making profound discoveries in cascades of linkage and awareness. And this process is untasted by most adults. Most adults very rarely have had any experience of this. But what I want to make clear is that I believe it's our natural state. And when we are, when the substituting cultural transports are removed, and what they are substituted for is replaced, which are things like our relationship with the sun, water, food, the sky, the moon, animals, each other, and perhaps dreaming. When these things are replaced, the amputated aspects of our relational selves immediately come back to life and begin regrowing and remaking the webs of intimacy and relation which are their natural environment. Now, as I've said a few times, water is a crucially overlooked aspect of our human environmental necessity. But not just our environmental necessity, our relational necessity. When you see an image like this and you can imagine the sort of bending, warping, pulsing shapes of the reflections of light on the water, you see one of the most powerful natural induction triggers for this learning trance or liquid intimacy that I'm talking about. Now, what happens when we see this and when we're exposed to it over a long period of time, such as someone who was sitting next to a pool of water, say like a fisherman might, is that actually a kind of psycho-emotional feedback process begins where there is a pulsing rhythm to the shifting reflections on the water, and these produce both visual feedback, like you can see here, which is reminiscent of the spiral that we saw, but this is a much more liquid and unformed version of that. But also physical sensations that are extremely uncommon, where you can feel as though your body is actually pulsing, and that it's pulsing and changing, pulsing and swirling. This particular visual phenomenon is among the most powerful learning inductions on the planet and is ignored by almost everybody. Many people engage in it unconsciously, right? They'll go and sit next to the water and kind of enjoy it, not really realizing why they're enjoying it. But our brains are capable of entering states that are really uncommon to our normal experience through a process called photic driving or optic driving. And water, particularly water on which a reflection is shifting in a rhythmic pattern, is the most astonishing and accessible induction to this form of learning trance. So I really want to invite you to take some time and watch and allow yourself to become deeply immersed in the moving reflections of light on water. there are few more dramatic leaping off points from ordinary consciousness than this. And I think, actually, I want to say that it's so profound to have this experience once you've recognized it, that it really trumps what's available in the lion's share of psychedelic experience. When you're sober and you're drawn into this liquid intimacy or liquid sentience, the learning trance that I'm speaking of as the opposite of what our culture and our kind of narrative intoxication denies us, you immediately recognize that there's something going on Earth that's nothing like any of the stories, and that all of our cults are confused and storyful, and that our actual nature, each one of us uniquely and yet completely, encompasses the most astonishing forms of polyphony of identity, meaning, purpose, and potential, nearly all of which are blocked even by those practices and cults that purport to deliver them back to us. So we have to be really careful of dogma, and of course, having these experiences that tend to wipe away the concretizations of consciousness, the static forms of identity and models that we live by and think with. These are very powerful catalysts for our learning and growth that we ordinarily are not exposed to and that are absolutely crucial to our humanity. Now, of all of the possible things that induct us into intimacy and the kind of learning trance, living eyes are perhaps the most profound. And for us, being human, we're evolutionarily adapted to read the human gaze. And of course, the face is really what we think of when we think of people. In fact, this word fascinated seems to imply a relationship with the face. The eyes are a non-verbal communication transport, very unlike the rectangle, as you can see right here. They seem to transmit a changing flow, which is also an invitation, that is fraught with meaning, that cannot be monophonic meaning, and will not fit in language, and cannot be encompassed by it. Now, of course, this is true not just of human eyes, but also of the eyes of all living beings, and even living beings themselves, our hands, our bodies, the tree, the shapes of nature, call us back to recognition and intimacy with our evolutionary past and our relational potentials. And this is, of course, another endangered sense, because as we become more technological, we join the church of distance. We no longer need to really know each other. We can be satisfied with the theatrical representations our technology substitutes for each other in places like MySpace or Facebook or Twitter or Tumblr, etc. And this is at once an outgrowth of human relation, but also, again, a way of substituting the rectangle, little rectangles of text, little rectangles of images, little rectangles of video, for direct contact. And I think it's better to have a sense of entrance, to enter into actual relation, than to remain in trance, to be beguiled by the theatrics presented across the rectangle. And before I close, I'd just like to introduce perhaps one more window that invites us into intimacy and liquid sentience, the dreaming trance that is our nature to inhabit, and of course, which was our natural state as infants. In fact, this was the form of intelligence with which we acquired language, and it is precisely the form of intelligence that language attacked and largely replaced once it was acquired. And I believe that this is probably where our imagination went. Believe me, we did not grow out of the incredibly dynamic imagination that we had as children. Something else happened. Something, and I think it's in language, it's language and enculturation, basically took over the assets that were in use by the imagination, co-opted them, and then denied those assets and continued with the process of amputations that I've discussed throughout this video. But an immediate return to a childlike dreamlike state is accomplished almost any time we simply gaze at the night sky and see the stars where this is possible. Now, of course, for many of us in our modern cultures, light pollution largely replaces what we would otherwise see of the starscape. But like the daytime sky, the nighttime sky is another of the most profound invitations to rediscover our actual relationships with the universe, with ourselves, with other living beings, and with learning. In the night, when the sun is gone, we become many minds, like the many lights of the sky, as we dream, and our sentience and creativity and imagination are liquidly interacting. We are no longer trapped in the peculiar, monotonal world of identity and meaning that our waking lives often constrict us into. And so the starry sky is another of the most profound invitations to recognition and remembrance that nature provides and that our culture would rather give us substitutes for. Now, hopefully, after thinking about all these matters, we may find ourselves equipped to not only resist the rectangle, but to use it against some of the forces that deploy it as a substitute for our human intimacy, our incredibly prodigious learning capacities that are often hidden and co-opted by our cultural agendas, and that we can begin to retrieve these with and for each other in our world and use them to protect the natural windows, the water, the animals, the forest, each other, the air, the sky, and our dream.